always been amazed by how quickly diabetes manages to instill itself in your life. It's like one day you're fine, and then the next thing you know, you're being told you're diabetic. And then things are never quite the same again. Fortunately, for all the problems this disease causes, it does have its advantages. Patience, for example, is a virtue I strongly believe you can learn through being diabetic. More specifically, in waiting 3 hours for your endocrinologist so that he can talk to you for a whole 3 minutes. Now the downside to that is, if you're waiting for your blood sugar to go up or down, your patience might run a bit thin. Another good thing, and this is one parents might like, is that you get plenty of math practice in figuring out how many carbs you need to eat or how much medicine you need to take. Of course, the downside to having to do math is, of course, having to do math. I don't want to do any math. You probably don't want to do any math. Let's all agree that math isn't the funnest pastime. Now, I happen to think that one of the bigger advantages to being diabetic is getting rid of certain fears, like needles. Now, I used to be terrified of needles, and the doctors, because they were the ones with the needles. My sister likes to tell me a story about how when I was younger, they tried to give me a vaccine, and I just took off running like a bat straight out of hell. I was a great kid. Needless to say, after about 7 years of stabbing my finger repeatedly and 1 week of injecting insulin, I'm pretty good with needles now. Unfortunately, diabetes does provide you with some very particular fears, like going into kidney failure or losing an appendage. I know none of that is probably going to happen to me because I take such good care of myself, but certain fears are still there all the time, and they keep me up and worry me to the point where I have found myself making bookmarks or sewing at 3 a.m. in order to calm myself down. I find myself missing the fear of needles sometimes. Now, as terrible as certain fears or doing math is, there's actually one thing that's worse, and that's how people act towards diabetics. I see quite a bit of ads on healthy eating and how it prevents diabetes, and that's great, but it doesn't always help, and it leads to us being blamed for being diabetic. Because of the way the information is presented, people walk around with the misconception that you get diabetes by eating cake or candy or soda, when it's actually not that simple. If you happen to be a type 1 diabetic, eating fruits and vegetables is not going to help you at all. Now, if you happen to be a type 2 diabetic like me, then diet does play a role, and eating healthy can help, but genetics also plays a really big role, so if you eat unhealthily, you're going to need those pesky genetics of yours to get you chugging down the diabetes highway. But again, because this information isn't out there in a way that many people can see it, as a diabetic, you get to hear people make jokes like, "Oh, I just ate a bunch of candy, so I probably have diabetes now." And at first that's fine, but after a bad day or after hearing that several times, it does get offensive. Because diabetes is a real disease that can be very deadly, and there are about 25 million diabetics walking around out there, which means you probably know someone or will know someone who is a diabetic, and I would like to think you're not going to make fun of a friend or family member for a disease that could potentially kill them. Fortunately, you can turn this downside to being diabetic into something not so bad and maybe even a bit fun. And the way to do that is to do whatever you have to do to make being diabetic more bearable. Whether that means complaining or making jokes that are dumb, but still based on knowledge. You just do what makes you happy. For me, that happens to be celebrating my diabetic anniversary. Each year I come up with a theme, bake a small cake, and take a charming photo with my meter. I mean, I know celebrating a diabetic anniversary is pretty silly, but it does make me happy, and I figure that if I'm going to be stuck with this disease, I might as well get something out of it, like cake, or a party. At the end of the day, being a diabetic is a learning curve, and a giant one at that. Every day you either learn something new, or have to deal with something new. But with a tiny bit of optimism, and a little help from the people around you, whether they be diabetic or not, you learn the best thing you can learn as a diabetic. And that's that everything's going to be okay. You're going to be okay.